My name is Max Ginsburg, and I am a realist painter whose work primarily reflects the social conditions of our time. However, I would not have been able to paint the way I do without the teachings of my father, Abraham Ginsburg. On my 90th birthday, I would like to honor my father's life and work by presenting his biography and select paintings in video form. First, I will tell the story of his life and journey from Tsarist Russia to New York City, where he learned how to paint and became an artist. Then I will directly show some of his work from my studio, explaining his techniques and viewpoint. Thank you very much for viewing this video. I hope it serves a both educational and inspirational purpose. My father, Abraham Ginsburg, was born in Odessa, Ukraine in 1891. He was the fourth of 7 children. He showed an interest in art, but his father, a Hebrew teacher, told him it would be too difficult to make a living and suggested he study architecture instead. When he was a teenager, he became involved in an anti-Tsarist group and was given a bomb to hide, which he did in his father's Hebrew school. When it accidentally exploded, he was arrested and sent to a prison in Siberia for a year. When he was set free, he was ordered to work on neighboring farms. After a few months, he fled back to Odessa. However, his family had emigrated to New York, so he came to America too in 1912. In 1918, he followed his dream to become an artist and enrolled in the National Academy of Design. He quickly became one of the leading talents in the school, winning most of the prizes. His prime teachers were Charles Hawthorne for drawing and Ivan Olinsky for painting. When he graduated in 1922, he won a 2-year fellowship to study in Berlin and Paris. After he returned to New York, a friend told him that the movie industry needed artists who could paint portraits of actors and suggested that he show them his work. But he told my father that when they asked his fee, he should say $150 a painting, because if he charged less, they would think he was not good enough for the job. So he did as his friend said, even though $5 or $10 would have been fine with him. They loved his work, and he painted one a day for 4 years until 1929. Shortly after, he met my mother, and they were married in 1927. She was a student of pharmacy at Fordham University. In 1929, he decided to venture into painting, fine art, and portraits. He bought a new Ford, and my mother joined him to drive across the country. He painted primarily Native Americans in the Southwest who would pose for a fee. When they arrived in Los Angeles to visit his brother, he painted my Aunt Geneva in 1930. In 1931, they traveled to Paris, where I was born. Later, in 1932, we traveled to the island of Mallorca, Spain, and inspired by artists like Sorolla, he painted fishermen and workers around the seashore and docks. We returned to the United States in 1933 and lived in Brooklyn, first in Brighton Beach, and later in 1936 moved to Borough Park. But his studio was at 32 Union Square in Manhattan. Then, several years later, He moved his studio to 939 8th Avenue until the early 1980s. He painted wonderful portraits, mostly from life, but sometimes from photographs. My father was a true artist. He simply loved to paint. If people were not posing, he would paint whatever was in front of him. Sometimes it was fruit, or a table, or a couch, or a room interior. When he came to babysit for my children, he would paint them sleeping or watching TV. He would paint my mother even if she were not posing, but simply resting or reading a book. He would take a small paint box, such as the ones you are seeing on the screen here, to Central Park and paint the people in the park and the park itself. He would go to the automat, not to eat, but to sketch, in pencil on paper napkins, the variety of people eating, and then go back to his studio to paint what he had sketched. When people visited, he sketched while they talked. He especially loved color. When he was younger, his color was extremely sensitive and perceptive. He really painted the colors that he saw in reality, never the formulas for painting the color of things. As he aged, his colors became bolder and more vibrant, but still based on his sensitive observation of the form he saw. He painted portraits until about 1980, when his eyesight began to fail and he began to develop Alzheimer's. However, he continued to paint smaller paintings, mostly at home in their small apartment in Manhattan's Upper West Side. He died in an old age home for the blind in 1994 at the age of 93. A few years after he died, I entered one of his early self-portraits into an exhibition at the National Academy of Design, and the Smithsonian Institution purchased it for their collection. Now I will show some work by my father directly, as well as some photographs, and give a few words on each image, especially pertaining to his life in chronological order. My father had gone to the National Academy of Design and learned to paint, and he was very good. He won many prizes, and then received a 2-year scholarship to study in Berlin and Paris. Now this is one of his first paintings, a self-portrait that he did at that time. And you can see the style of painting and the sensitivity and the expertness. And remember, he was a young guy. I mean, that's a young guy there. He was still in his 20s. All right, this is my father, I think around the same time as the painting I showed you. And it looks like he's a young guy at an easel ready to paint. So I'm not sure where this was taken. It could have been in Paris, or it could have been in Berlin, or in New York City. Now this painting is a painting of my mother that my father painted around 1926 or 27. And this painting is actually in my home. I don't have it here in my studio now. but you can see an image of it, that I have on the screen. And here he painted my mother, who was a student of pharmacy at Fordham University. And when she came home, she took a nap. So here she is napping. I think it's a very beautiful painting, extremely sensitive. I pay attention especially to the colors and the sensitivity and the variation. And also, even though he is very careful in his proportions, still there is an alla prima approach to his painting that makes it, for me and many people, very exciting. This is another painting of my mother, and my father captured her doing her homework, again for her studies at Fordham University. And like in the other painting, there is for me at least, I see a wonderful sensitivity to proportions and to the delicacy of the forms. These are some of the paintings that my father did for the movie industry. And it was just amazing to know how he did this. They would give him black and white photographs, and he would be able to paint these paintings in color. Of course, he was able to do that because he had been painting and studying painting from life. So he knew how the colors would look realistically and naturally, yet it was rather loosely painted. So here is one that he did of a famous actress in the 1920s, Lillian Gish. Now here is another one that he did around the same time, and this was of Greta Garbo. Now he painted these between 1924 and 29. So I'm not sure exactly which year he did what, but he would be doing one a day for 4 years while he was doing this. Now here is one that he painted of Lon Chaney. He was a swashbuckler actor at that time, and you can see he looks very adventurous and very athletic. But I think that the painting that he did is simply magnificent. Now, he only did the paintings that you see here. The drawings on this reproduction are not his. And again, he did this the same way that he did the other paintings. And these were all for silent films. In 1927, my parents got married in New York City. This is them at that time. This is a painting that my father painted in 1931. After he finished painting for the movie actors and the movie industry, he went to California in Los Angeles, and he painted this portrait of my Aunt Geneva. I think it's a beautiful portrait, and I think that his skills were prime at this time. The sensitivity of his form is really great. In 1931, my father painted this painting when I was born. They were in Paris at the time, and that's where I was born. And my father obviously was happy about my birth, so he's smiling and he's playing his guitar, and he used to sing Russian songs occasionally. So he really has expressed a wonderful bravado in this painting. And of course, his style of painting is very painterly. This is a picture of my father in his first studio in New York City. We just came back from Paris in 1933, and we lived in Brooklyn. But he had to get a studio, so it was in this place at 32 Union Square. This is a pretty dark photograph, but if you can make it out, it's of my father holding me. That's how I looked like a long time ago, almost 90 years ago. And I thought it was very cute. This is a painting that my father painted around 1940. Now, at that time, he was already in another studio, which was at 939 8th Avenue. And over here, he was painting in his usual manner. Of course, the painting was in color, even though the reproduction is just a black and white photograph. This is a picture of my father standing at his easel. In fact, this easel here, when he finished this portrait. This portrait is more typical of most of his commissioned work, which was just beautifully painted. That's why many people ordered portraits from him. But in it, you can also see pretty well how he looked. Now, I estimate that this picture was taken probably in the 1950s, or about 1950. Here's another photograph of my father, but there's no painting in this photograph, but he's just sitting on his couch, but it's really a wonderful photograph of him. This must have been in the late 50s, maybe 1960. And this is in my father's studio. You can see a little bit of the wall and the backdrop, which is usually behind where he painted the models. I believe this is about 1960, and here is my father standing in front of a painting that he did of Coretta Scott King, the wife of Dr. Martin Luther King, and he was commissioned by the trade union 1199, which is the hospital workers union. In about, I think it was the 1950s or so, my father painted this self-portrait, and it's one of, I think, his best. He's got a beautiful expression, and behind him, he painted a painting that was on his wall of my mother. And that painting of my mother he painted quite a few years before this. So he felt that he wanted to have her image behind him in this painting. And, skillfully, it is really beautifully painted. If you compare the values, this is something I often tell students, compare the values of things. For example, the white blouse my mother is wearing with the light shirt my father has, or the lights on his head. And you see how those lights are lighter than the white blouse. So this is a lesson that I usually give my students, where I say, paint what you see, not what you know. And this is something that my father got from Charles Hawthorne, who was his teacher at the National Academy. All right, this is one of the many paintings my father painted when he went into Central Park, and he just painted people that he saw sitting around in the park on the bench. And they usually had tremendous, wonderful color in them. It's also a little bit of that Sorolla influence of painting outdoors. And I want to also mention that he painted some of these, not only on canvas, but on photostat paper, which he sometimes used when he had to do certain kinds of painting. And when he used the paper, he saved the paper and then used it to paint on the backside. This is a piece of the photostat paper, so he cut it down to the size that he wanted in order to do this painting. Often I remember as a kid coming into my father's studio, and he would have a class of some students who wanted to paint, and it was usually on a Saturday. So this is an example of some of the painting that he would paint at the same time, and then he would teach them. So here is a nude who posed at that time, and this must have been, I would say in the 1940s, 50s into the 60s. Very often, I would say in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, my father would go into the Automat, a restaurant near his studio, and he would sit down and sketch a lot of people as they were eating, getting food. It was interesting because you had the most unlikely people sitting at the same table. And there were all kinds of characters. And he usually went in there not to eat, but to sketch and to just have sketches on napkins, paper napkins. Then he would go back to his studio and paint them like this. This is one of my favorite still lifes that my father ever did. One of the factors here that I like so much is the juicy feeling of the grapes. So you really have the texture of that. I compare this often with grapes I've seen by other artists, even old masters, where the grapes look like little rocks with highlights on them. But here I think it's so beautiful the way he's painted them in. You hardly see outlines between each grape, but you really get the feeling of that transparency of grapes that are full of juice. I even like the way he painted the peaches. Now this is another one of his still lifes that I think is amazing. I remember this for when he did it a long time ago. And the tea kettle on the side we often called a chinik. That's a Jewish word for a tea kettle. So that's what it was called. And the other was, I believe, a frying pan, and we often called that a tovala, and that was a Jewish word for the frying pan. So this was a still life in the kitchen, and as I said, nothing was safe. He painted everything, but notice the brilliant coloring. For example, the purplish tones here, the sharp yellowish light over here, the fading of the information here, the highlight on this part of the handle. See, all this was, you might say, abstract forms that he saw. And in reality, it is these abstract forms that make the reality more realistic. My father painted a lot of paintings of me and my mother. And this is a painting of me before I grew a beard. So over here, he's got me starting to walk. So this must have been in 1932. And of course, it's a quick sketch, but I was not a very good model, but he was a fast painter. Here is another painting my father did of me. Well, I think I was a little older, so I probably posed better, but it looks like I stayed still because I was drawing, and you can see on the right side of me there is a little radio, an Emerson radio of that time period. So I must have been about 4 or 5 years old. And one of the things that I marvel about his work is his use of color and his boldness. Well, here I'm a little bit older, and my father painted me again. I must have been about 10 or 11. At any rate, he painted these on canvas, and they're actually off the canvas because he probably had them on stretchers when he did them. But this is, I think, a very beautiful painting of me, and I love his brush strokes and the way he saw color. He was a master of color. Back in 1944 or so, when I was about 13 or 14, I posed for my father in this painting. He was influenced by Sorolla, so you can see he's painting outdoors with the natural light and the sunlight. And I think it's magnificent the way he was able to see the color and the form. So that, for example, in the body, you see the color. It isn't just dark and light, but there's some beautiful color in there, or even in the head. And he's able to get this feeling of space. Now, this is a friend of mine around the same age as me, who was also posing for my father at that time. Around the same time as the previous painting of myself and a friend on a log, 1945 or so, my father painted my mother sitting in the sun. And this is one of many paintings he did like that, where he really got the effect of the person and the sunlight. And it's just a beautiful put together painting, and of course it's a small sketch, so it's quite rough. But still, he's suggested a lot of detail. But now here, she's reading a paper and in the sun. And the manner in which he painted this is rather impressionistic, but his drawing is excellent, and of course his color is beautiful as usual. The way he gets the color of the bright sun on the forms, and he doesn't paint in much detail, but everything is very expressive and explanatory. Now here is a painting my father did of my mother watching TV. You might say, watching TV? What are you talking about? She's sleeping and there's no TV in the picture. Well, when she watched TV, she usually fell asleep. So that was my father's chance to paint her. So he painted her, but he was very fast. So if you notice, he painted her face without her mouth open. Because when she fell asleep after a while, her mouth would open. But she was never safe. Here is a painting that my father painted of my mother. Must have been in the late 60s or so. And she's taking a nap on a bed. And I find that it's extremely painterly and I think very beautiful. I love the way he painted form. He wouldn't paint in just details and outlines, but paint the form of the figure. The way he painted the feet is so beautiful and painterly. He seemed like he had a sense of humor, and so he even painted in the socks, my mother's socks that she placed on the bed. Now, when my father came around to babysit for my children, you would expect him to paint them, and that's exactly what he did. As an artist, he felt that he should paint them. And this, I think, is a beautiful painting of them watching television. He captured their alertness. And that is something that they normally could not pose for because they're just young kids. This must have been done in about 1968 or so. So my son is a little older. My daughter is a little younger, about 7 years old. And also in his later work, his work was much more painterly and less detailed or rendered. And that's another beautiful aspect of his work, which you'll see in many of his later sketches. My father came to babysit my children. So of course, what do? You paint them. So here he painted my daughter when she was a little girl. And it's a lovely feeling that he gets. But I just am really taken by the way in which a lot of the forms and tones in the painting blend together, and they look wonderful that way, instead of making outlines. Of all the models, however, I believe my father was the most available. So he always painted himself. Maybe the only person who was more available for a self-portrait was Rembrandt. But I love the way he painted these forms, and some things almost blend and sort of evolve out of an atmosphere. And his use of color I find exciting. The way he sees the color in the light on the top of the head, and then the faded colors as he goes down the cheek and gets that smile on his face. Another self-portrait. One of the things that he's done so well is to paint a general space of color without any detail, and yet he gets an amazing likeness. Anybody looking at this could tell it's him. Over here, the color of the face with the various purplish tones is really just beautifully painted. And the way he's got color in his skin is also amazing. You can see a variety of color painted on in a painterly way. I have used this painting to show to my students that about the use of color so effectively and the absence of detail that is not necessary. I often ask my students, what is the color of white teeth? And of course they would say white, or sometimes they would think I'm being tricky. But the fact is that when we look at this painting and we see his teeth, they don't look so white. On the other hand, if you talk about the color of his white shirt, that looks whiter, or even his hair. So a lot has to do with the light on the subject. But in general, I believe this is one of the nicest self-portraits my father has done. You know, it really captures his happy spirit. My father had painted some paintings that look a little more rendered, but most of them are very painterly, and you would say juicy paintings. Now, in this one, he has a rather dramatic dark and light feeling, as if he's thinking, contemplating, and of course it's very powerful. His use of his painting of the bold forms is really very sculptural. If you look at that eye, and you see the way the eye is drawn and painted, very sculptural. On the other hand, when you look at the nose, you really get the sheen of the light hitting the nose in contrast to the light on the cheek. What I find interesting about this painting is the way he's wearing the hat. I guess he wanted to have the hat on to create a bit of a shade on his face. So he would paint his face in the shade with the light primarily on his body. Also, this is very typical of how he would be sitting and painting on a small painting. Now it looks like he's holding a brush, and you can see a part of the small painting right over here in this section. Go. My father painted a lot of models in his studio when he had a class. He would have a lot of students come in to paint. And when he went around teaching them, he spent a part of the time doing his own painting. Now this was pretty big in size for 3 hours, but he would use a big brush and just go swinging away with the paint. And people marveled at the way he was able to get the form and the likeness and make an exciting painting. If you look at the shirt, for example, you see the broad, thick strokes of paint, and yet they are right. They're done so that you really see the realism of the form. And then when you get into the face, you really get the feeling of the character. You know, the quality of this young girl, and it's all broad strokes. Now, you know this woman is kind of blonde, but it doesn't mean he's using yellow. He uses the color that he sees in real life. And that's why I feel he is so great, because he sees the reality of the form in front of him, never follows a formula, but paints the individual characteristics of what he sees. In my father's Saturday classes, he also painted models who posed for the figure. And of course, this looks like a dancer. And he would get the gesture and the characteristics very fast. What I marvel here at is his ability to see his proportions rather quickly, because he really went at it very fast. And again, with a big brush, never hesitating. I know that when I paint, I'm much more deliberate, but he had a lot of daring, and just amazing. Now I imagine it's besides having a lot of talent, it's is the result of some very good training that he got at the National Academy of Design, although they worked much more academically. My father used to tell me that a big artist uses a big brush. Now in this painting, you can see he must have used a big brush because the strokes are so broad. However, in addition, the expression of the person and the particular character of the person is so revealing, just with those big brush strokes, because you really feel the particular kind of person this is. Even in the expression of the person, in the eyes, you get a whole story of the personality of this model. I would like to end this video by reiterating how much of an influence my father had in my painting development and viewpoint, even today. For example, I still use his easel here in my studio. You can see the way my father painted influenced my alla prima style. The colors in my palette are basically what he used in his palette throughout his life. Thank you for joining me in the month of my 90th birthday to celebrate and commemorate the life and work of my father.